Why is Generation Z named with the last letter of the alphabet? And where did that naming structure, where did that pattern even come from? In today's video, that's what we're going to try to figure out. And what we'll figure out is it comes from our parents, Generation X. So let's look into it. Like I was saying before, this pattern began all the way back with our parents' generation, actually before them with baby boomers, back in the early 1960s with Generation X. Before they found out this name, before they decided collectively as a culture, before we've decided that was the name, they went through a bunch of different ones. Some called them Latchkey Kids. Other one, it was the MTV Generation. Other times, it was the Baby Busters. But none of these really caught on until a novel by an author by the name of Douglas Coupland. And now, again, I said this last time I talked about him, but I'm not sure if I'm getting that pronunciation right. But he wrote a novel that was very critically acclaimed in the early 1990s, late 1980s, called Generation X. But that idea, that name Generation X, began even further back with baby boomers in the early 1960s, all the way in the UK. So there was a woman by the name of Jane Deverson, and she was working in a newspaper. Oh, I believe it was actually a magazine. I'm sorry, I misspoke. And in this magazine, she was hired to do a whole piece on the youth in the UK at that time. Deverson spent 6 months traveling across northern England, engaging with teens from various backgrounds. However, when she submitted her interviews, her editor was totally unimpressed. He said, "What's this?" Deverson recalled. He shouted, "You are saying young people sleep together before they are married, don't believe in God, dislike the Queen, and don't respect parents? I can't print this." Yet the material was too valuable to discard, and fortunately for Deverson, she encountered Hamblett, who was a well-known, and again I'm probably butchering that name, Hamblett, a well-known Hollywood correspondent. He was the one who coined the phrase Generation X, and their collaboration became a book that was a big pioneering work in pop psychology, or I should say pop sociology. It was a huge success, which Mick Jagger was reportedly a great admirer of, and so was John Lennon as well. Here's a quote by her. She said, "It was partly X, as in the unknown. Teenagers were a mystery. It was also so shocking at the time, like an X film, because the book interviews pulled no punches." This work of sociology by Jane Deverson and Charles Hamblett did a great job of cementing at least the moniker and idea of Gen X into the culture. But it wasn't until Douglas Coupland really popularized the term with his book Generation X, Tales for an Accelerated Culture. Because in fact, the people that Jane Deverson and Charles Hamblett were interviewing at the time, these teenagers, would have actually met baby boomers, not Generation X. So while this idea of generation being the unknown and them being rebellious might have been very fascinating and impacted people like Mick Jagger and John Lennon, at the same time, who were they impacting? Well, they were impacting baby boomers, not Generation X. So the question then becomes, how did that become Generation X's full name? Why was that the one that came after baby boomers? And that, of course, like I said, is Douglas Coupland. He wrote a book called Generation X, Tales for an Accelerated Culture, which did a great job digging into this culture, and I'm going to overuse that word, so get ready, but it dug into this culture of commercialization, everything being an ad, everything being a brand, and it spotlights a couple of early, I believe the college graduates, but young adults who were struggling with the society that they were growing up in, struggling with this feeling of stagnancy, this feeling of the pressure on them to live these normal lives in a culture of commercialization, of everything seeming to be corporate and turning you into an object of work and suburban life. This book even coined new words like McJob for a job that was entry level in a corporation like McDonald's. To another one was mental ground zero, or celebrity schadenfreude, or occupational slumming. A lot of these words ended up in common vernacular afterwards, along with Generation X. There was even a chapter entitled "I am not your target market," or "I am not a target market," which which is a fascinating coincidence or irony, because Generation X as a moniker became an incredibly big marketing gimmick. This targeting Generation X, this Generation X. Now we see that much more commonly than we did in the past. So the book that actually coined these terms that made Generation X what it is as a name ended up being used in the exact opposite ways it was intended. And that is both fascinating and a little scary about how the corporations and our modern culture can take something and twist it to serve other ends. From this book came, of course, the popularization of the word Generation X for the middle generation between millennials and baby boomers. And that's fascinating on its own. But as a deeper concept, what else is really interesting is that each part of this story that we talked about today both show how the original concept, the original intention was morphed and changed instead of being what it originally was. And it shows how ideas can be turned from something organic and on the ground, like with Jane Deverson and Charles Hamblett, how they interviewed these normal teenagers in the UK and then influenced people like Mick Jagger, and how that becomes popular music, right? Because it influenced John Lennon and the Beatles and Mick Jagger, and then it's repackaged. So what's on the ground gets heard and then put into a book and then repackaged for the public, changing the original meaning. And then finally, most of all, happened with Douglas Copeland's book, which was in many ways against the commercialization, against the marketing gimmicks. And instead, this name became exactly that, became a way to target people ages now at this point between 50 and between, I don't know, 45 and 60, targeting them specifically to buy what they want to buy, to create nostalgia for them as well. So that to me is another fascinating part about looking into this story. But like I said, this is the arc of how Generation X, our parents, while they might be sandwiched between more known generations like baby boomers and millennials, were actually the start of the naming trend that stops with us today. So that was how Generation X started the idea of naming Generation X, Y, and then finally to us, Z. Thanks for looking into it, and I'll see you in the next one.